camera is somewhat better than it was. And let's see. Test, test, test. Okay, that's working. So, and it looks like it's going to try and follow me, which is probably not a good thing. They apparently fixed that feature, which I don't take as much of a feature because every time one of you moves, it picks you up and then it like doesn't track and it moves around quite a lot. But anyway, at least for those people that watch the live stream or watch it, after it's ended, they can at least kind of see me this time, so it's not quite so bad. So we're going to talk about channels marketing today. This is the place part of marketing. It's the part of marketing that nobody thinks of as being marketing. It's how you get goods from producer to, or services from producer to consumer ultimately. And it's one of the oldest fields of marketing. It's also the field that I probably know the least about and was the least interested in. When I went to get my PhD, I actually went down and talked to OU because I didn't really want to leave Oklahoma. I had a fairly nice house in Edgemere Park, and I wanted to stay in this area and continue to work part-time. And so I went down and talked to OU, and they made my blood run cold over a couple of things that the department chair down there said. They said, well, we'll admit you, but we hope that you don't want to go to a teaching institution because getting a PhD is about research. It's a research degree, and teaching is something that you must endure in order to do research. And I thought, no, that's not really what I want to do. I really want to teach. I like teaching more now. I mean, I do a fair amount of research, but I really like teaching far more than I enjoy research. So that sort of made my blood run cold. And then the thing that sort of cut it off absolutely for me was when she said, and I hope you enjoy logistics because that's what we are. We're a logistics school. And I thought, I can't imagine anything more horrifically boring than researching in the field of logistics. Now, it sort of makes sense that OU would be a logistics school because Oklahoma sits smack dab in the middle of the country. We have I-35, I-40, I-44 that run through the state. And so we have a lot of transportation. We have a lot of transportation companies here. And so gathering data is probably pretty easy in places like Oklahoma. And so it kind of makes sense that they are or at the time, I don't know that they still are, that they were interested in that kind of research. Again, this is one of the oldest fields of marketing. Marketing as an academic discipline really starts with a recognition that you have to get particularly perishable goods to consumers in an efficient way. And so it's the part of marketing that, again, nobody really thinks of as being marketing, but is really one of the older fields. And marketing departments, academic marketing departments, a lot of times in the early days of academic marketing and the history of marketing thought, started at schools that were ag schools, and they're extensions of agricultural economics, and trying to figure out which is the most sort of efficient way of moving things to market. And so it is the place of the 4 Ps. So we organize marketing around product, price, place, and promotion. And this is the part that focuses on getting those goods to flow, like through a pipeline is the analogy, which is why we call it channels, through which liquid flows to consumers. So channels make the movement of goods and services from producer to consumer possible. And it's often not thought of by the consumer. And there's a classic sort of modern version of this kind of studies that were done by early agricultural economists that was done by Rose George, who's not a marketer, she was a journalist. And I've mentioned this book before. She wrote a book called 90% of Everything. And it's interesting, she starts out in Great Britain and she asks people how much of their products and services come to them, or products come to them by shipping. And remarkably, people say not very much. And it turns out that 90% of everything at some point in time comes to you on a ship. If you think about just, like all of the shirts, clothing, textiles, electronics that you use. How does that get here? Well, a lot of it is by shipping container, and it's enormously efficient and it's pretty cheap. Apple does not use shipping containers to ship their iPhones over here. They actually do fly them over because they view that as being more efficient, and time is of the essence, particularly when they release new versions. But other people do ship their products across in container ship. And I ask students every semester, what do you think it costs to ship an item that's about the size of an iPhone across the ocean from either China or India or someplace like that into the United States, into a port in the US? What do you suppose the cost is? It may have gone up a little bit since the last time I checked. Anybody want to guess? Yeah, you had your hand up first. Yeah, just how much do you think it costs? I mean, they're shipping hundreds, but what's the cost of the individual item for $4? That's really high. That's a good 35 cents. That's still high. Yeah. What do you? It's a couple cents. Yeah, it's about 5 cents, and it's probably gone up since. It's probably gone up because we've had a lot of issues in terms of disruptions of the supply chain as a result of things like COVID, and then obviously costs have gone up. But it's just pennies to ship one item that's about the size of an iPhone or a Google Pixel phone or whatever it is that you have. It's not very much. Now, Apple, as I said, really doesn't do that. They do fly them over because they want their products to get here much more quickly. But the vast majority of stuff that we use comes to us from other locations. It's shipped at some point in its transportation, and it arrives here at the United States. We actually have, until you get to the West Coast, the westernmost and northernmost inland port in the United States. It's the port of Catoosa in Tulsa, and an enormous amount of stuff is shipped in and out of that port. Now, not usually iPhones and things like that. We're moving more grain and things like that, sand in and out. At the port of Muskogee, there is a tile manufacturer in Muskogee. They import thousands of pounds or hundreds of thousands of pounds of sand from the Middle East to make ceramic tiles every year. And I used to keep my boat at the port of Muskogee, so it was kind of interesting to watch that. Yeah, you go through a number of locks. I actually took my boat. I wanted to do what was called the Great Loop. So I put my boat at the port of Muskogee, because from the port of Muskogee, you can go all the way down to the Mississippi. From the Mississippi, you go into the Gulf of Mexico, and then you go around. You can go up through the Hudson in New York, and then through Lake Champlain, and then through the intercoastal waterways, and then back down. People do it. There's a guy in Guthrie who was a firefighter in Guthrie that I knew, who did the Great Loop with his wife on a 36-foot motor yacht, and it took him, I think, about a year and a half to do it. Most people take a year to do that trip. But yeah, you go through the Robert S. Curve. That's part of the dam system that they built in order to get enough water to be able to get barges up and down. But so the Port of Muskogee, or the Port of Catoosa, is the northern and most western inland port in the United States until you get to the West Coast. So we actually have quite a bit of stuff that's shipped through shipping. And so logistics is obviously an important part, and that's why probably OU focused on it in their College of Business. So the types of intermediaries, and a lot of people think of middlemen and they don't like middlemen because middlemen add costs, right? So what is a middleman? It's any intermediary between the producer and the end user. Now, what the internet has allowed us to do in some respects is engage in disintermediation, which means that we are now getting things directly from the producer, things that we never would have thought of before as being able to be sold direct to the consumer. The internet has allowed for things like textiles. I never thought that I would buy clothing off the internet when it first started occurring, because you kind of have to try clothes on generally. And the reason that they may fit differently, even within the same brand, is that when they are cut, they use these huge dies to stamp out patterns. And depending on where in the bolt the material falls, it can have an effect on the way the sizing fits. But I have found several producers that I like French cuff shirts. I have something like 135 of them, and I used to wear them all the time until they hired a dean who wore shorts, and I'm like, okay, that's it. I'm done. I'm not gonna wear a suit and tie anymore here. When the dean walked out and he's in shorts, okay, whatever. But I like French cuff shirts, and so I used to wear them all the time along with bow ties. That was kind of my statement. And I found a producer in the United Kingdom that produces French cuff shirts that fit me really, really well. And so it took me a couple of tries to get the sizing right, because they have different sizes in the United Kingdom than we have in the United States. They measure things differently. But once I figured it out, and they had easy return policy, that's where I order my shirts from. And so it's a direct, and it's cut out the middleman. Historically, what would you do to go buy shirts? Well, you'd go to Dillard's, right? Or Macy's, or Jacques Penney, that's J.C. Penney, or some department store and buy your shirts. And now you can actually get them direct. In some respects, we have seen re-intermediation. So for example, with things like Dell, historically, Dell was one of the companies that early on disintermediated and was selling direct to consumers. And you called Dell up and you ordered a computer. There was a commercial that they ran for a long period of time with this blonde-headed kid that would be like, dude, you're getting a Dell. And that's how they sold their product. Now, in some respects, they've re-intermediated, because with things like laptops, people actually want to touch them before they buy them. Not so much with a desktop, it's not as important, but the vast majority of us now are using laptops instead of desktops. Why? It's more convenient, it's mobile, we're not necessarily at one place. And so it's kind of important that you actually feel the laptop in order to test out whether it's like, is it too heavy? Is the keyboard too small? Things like that. But we have seen some disintermediation. So middleman is intermediary between producer and end user. Other terms that you'll hear are agent or broker. An agent or a broker is an intermediary with the legal authority to act on behalf of a manufacturer. Oftentimes, agents or brokers don't take actual title to the goods that they are selling. They simply act as a facilitator in the transaction. Now, this is kind of a loose analogy. It's like a real estate agent. Real estate agents deal in property, real property. And what is real property? Real property is defined as land and things that are permanently attached thereto. That is real property. So from a legal standpoint, what is real property? Well, homes. Now, if you rip that home, and I saw this in Houston this last weekend when I was down there for my niece's cheer competition. It's what I refer to as cheernastic. She gets very annoyed when I call it that, but it's no longer, cheer is not what it was when I was in high school, which was a couple of girls out there with pom-poms and doing a little routine. This is now like a highly competitive athletic sport that involves the combination of dance and gymnastics. But there was a house that they had actually taken and they put it on this huge truck and they were moving it. And it wasn't a mobile home. It was a traditional stick-built home that they had ripped out of the earth and were moving across town. And I got to watch part of it being moved. And they were lifting up the telephone wires in order to get the house under it. So at that point in time, that house has become what we call chattel property or personal property. When it was attached to the ground, it's real property. So real estate brokers don't actually take title to the real property that they're selling, which is the land and those things permanently attached and nothing is technically permanent, but when it's actually on a foundation, that's real property, and you sell it through transferring of title. They don't actually take title to the property, they just facilitate the transaction, right? And you have similar situation with a lot of goods, in that you'll have people that won't actually take title, coffee brokers, that will help facilitate and move the transaction along. A wholesaler is an intermediary who sells to other intermediaries. Usually this is retailers. A retailer is an intermediary that is at sort of the end of the pipeline, and they sell directly to consumers. So Walmart is a retailer, right? You all have a lot of experience with retailers. Amazon is a retailer. The convenience stores are retailers. A distributor is an imprecise term, and it's any intermediary who performs one or more of the functions. And some of them perform a lot of the functions, some of them just perform limited amounts of functions. And a dealer is an even more imprecise term that may mean a distributor, a retailer, or a wholesaler. So when I was in industry, we sold through a dealer network, and that was comprised of people who were independent agents that sold our product, which was learning management systems, to the K-12 market. Car dealers is an example of that, right? Car dealers are really retailers in the automotive industry, but they're called dealers. I don't know why. It's just a historic artifact of the way that they set up the system. Yes, sir. I think that they historically had a lot of purpose, because people like Henry Ford were not necessarily good at getting product to, and nobody wanted to drive to Michigan and get a car, right? So you needed a dealer network, and it was a way that corporations could sell their product without having a lot of the expense and a lot of the overhead. One of the reasons that we sold through a dealer network, the company that I worked for, was we were the smallest of the software manufacturers that did learning management systems in the K-12 market. And at the time the company was founded, they couldn't afford to hire a big sales force. And so if we sold through a distribution network, a distributor network, or a dealer network, it was better for us because we didn't have to pay all of the FICA taxes and stuff like that. Now, ultimately, when you outsource things like that, what you are recognizing is that you're inefficient, right? I mean, and somebody else is doing it more efficiently. So we actually gave a bigger profit margin to those individuals, because in order for them to make money and absorb those costs, they had to have a larger profit margin. We actually did start towards the end of my tenure. We had built up an inside sales force, because there were several states where we couldn't find people that were willing to go and take the risk of opening a dealership for us in those territories. And so we actually had an inside sales force that would call on schools in places like Nebraska and South Dakota, and places that nobody wants to live anymore, right? That people are moving out of. So intermediaries create value. They have transactional functions that create value. So they purchase products for resale, which means that they take a risk when they purchase the product. If they're holding the product and holding title to the product, there's a risk involved in that. The product could be destroyed or perish, right? So they sell, they promote the products. They find prospects. They engage in order taking. And in these shipping contracts, again, they're providing value because they're taking the risk that something may go wrong with the products. And I can give you an example of this. If you go down to Penn Square Mall, which I'm sure that almost all of you know where Penn Square Mall is, across the I-44 highway from Penn Square Mall is a big, large, dark tower, which is now called the Valiant Bank Tower. That tower was actually built for Penn Square Bank. Penn Square Bank in the 1980s almost took down Chase Manhattan because they were writing loans and selling them to Chase Manhattan for wildcatters in the oil business here in Oklahoma. And there's a book that details this called Funny Money. And if you really want to read something like a kind of interesting history of the oil business in Oklahoma. And by the way, in Oklahoma, we pronounce that business, Biddness, oil business. And it's a brilliant sort of, chronology of what happened. That building, so Penn Square Bank, and you can see their original building, it sits in the northwest corner of the Penn Square Mall parking lot. That was their original bank, and they were loaning lots of money to oil people in the Oklahoma oil industry. And they got so big that they decided they were going to build them a new headquarters, which was going to be this tower, which is now across I-44, and it's the Valiant Bank Tower building. They ordered a bunch of glass for that building. That glass was actually on a railroad car, and it got hit by, I believe, a tornado, and it was damaged. And so the case was actually one where they dealt with who assumes the risk of loss in the shipping contract. If you just specify FOB, according to the code, the UCC, the Uniform Commercial Code, the risk of loss passes from the producer to whoever has got title at that point, at the point at which the goods are placed in the flow of commerce by placing them with a shipper, right? So you can specify otherwise, and maybe you may want to say FOB Buyersville, in which case the risk of loss doesn't pass until you actually receive the goods, right? So they also assume the risk of perishability. Things like fruits and vegetables are highly perishable. They're transporting these over long distances, right, in the United States, and they can go bad. Products may also become obsolete before they are sold, in which case the intermediaries have taken a risk. They perform a logistical function, which adds value in that they create assortments of products. Retailers create assortments of products that you may need. When you used to go back to school shopping, when you were in, primary education, and they would give you a list, you all probably remember this. They did still do this, right? When you all were in primary, like you got a list from Mrs. Jones in the second grade of things that you were going to need, like the Big Chief tablet. I don't think they actually do this anymore. Do any of you remember the Big Chief tablets and the big pencils, the big fat pencils that you learned to write with? Don't remember. You're shaking your head now. Okay. I'm really dating myself. So you got the Big Chief tablet, and you got the pencils and the box of crayons that you're going to need for art and stuff like that. Well, Walmart creates those assortments of things for you, right? So they provide this assorting function, which adds value, so that when you go in, and I used to see this, particularly living in a small town like Guthrie, they would have Walmart would sort all of the different classes into, this is what you need for this class right here, and it would make it easy for you to get. They assemble and protect products at convenient locations for you to buy. So you don't want to have to buy, cases of, my favorite candy is Reese's Peanut Butter Cups, and I don't want to buy cases of Reese's Peanut Butter Cups. What do I want to buy? I want to buy like 1 package or 2 packages of Reese's Peanut Butter. I can eat like about 10 packages of Reese's Peanut Butter Cups, but I don't want to buy the whole case, right? Or a gross or something like that. So they buy them, they assemble them and protect them in a place where it's convenient for me to get them. And then of course they provide transportation functions, and that brings the products to you at a place that you want. Again, you didn't want to go to Detroit to get your Model T car. You had a dealer and shippers that would bring the models of cars to local areas. Tesla, your question about this, has attempted to do away with dealer networks and do direct-to-consumer purchasing of automobiles, right? So they have their own storefronts, basically, where you can buy Teslas. Anybody have a Tesla? My sister-in-law has a Tesla. It's a horrible car. Yep. Absolutely. That happened during COVID. Car prices. I actually bought a car for my mother for Mother's Day one year, like right before they closed all the dealers down, and then they reopened them almost instantly because they realized that this is an essential function, but I bought this car. And 2 weeks later, they sold me because they're like, we're closing down. We'll make you a deal today if you'll buy this car today. So I bought this car for my mother for Mother's Day. And 2 weeks later, the salesman called and was like, would you like to sell that car back? And I'm like, no, I don't want to sell the car back. And they offered me more than I paid for the car. But I would have had to have gone and bought another car at even more expense, right? So I was like, no, I don't want to sell the car back. But yeah, that was one of those weird times where cars actually appreciated in value because there was a limited supply. They had shut down manufacturing. Nobody knew when it was going to be reopened. And there were all of these issues. And so cars actually went up in value. A lot of things went up in value. I sold my boat at that time. It actually went up in value. At that period of time, the average boat buyer in America dropped. The average boat buyer in the United States before COVID was 65. During COVID, that age dropped to 45. 20 years. And boats actually appreciated in value. That was the one thing that, like, historically they drop like a rock the minute you buy. If you buy a new boat, the price it's not even half after you put it in the water usually. But during COVID, because people were looking for something to do and boating was seen as something that was relatively safe for you and your family, you could get outdoors and you were away from other people because you were on the lake or the ocean or whatever. It actually, they sold for more money. So it was kind of an unusual time. But yeah, so they actually do provide value in that they provide a location so you don't have to go to Detroit to buy your car. You can go to John Vance Motors or one of the others and pick up your car there rather than having to have it shipped. Now, again, Tesla has tried to disintermediate and sell direct to consumers. They provide facilitating functions. So a lot of times intermediaries will provide financing, for example, for people. They'll provide lines of credits. They'll provide grading, inspection, testing, and quality assurance. And customers benefit when they have the goods and services that they want, when they want, where they want, and how they want them. So the structure of the channel. Marketers seek to find the most efficient route to add value. So for consumer products and services, there are several ways you can do this. You can have a disintermediated channel where it's direct consumer. And I said that this is becoming more and more common, although again, we're seeing some reintermediation in some things, like with Dell computers. Dell was actually selling to retailers because people, again, want to actually go and try out the laptop. It's kind of important to do that. But you can have a direct channel. Schwann's is an example of a direct channel. De Beers is now an example of direct channel. They actually are no longer at such a huge percentage of the market that they face antitrust. They face antitrust enforcement actions by the United States. And so De Beers has opened up direct consumer retail outlets of diamonds. So De Beers was until recently the largest sort of supplier of diamonds, and they are the reason why you give your fiancé, that's Oklahoman for fiance, a diamond ring. Historically, if you went back to the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century, people gave their intended lots of different stones for engagement rings. Oftentimes, they were given the birthstone of the lady that they intended to marry. You would give her birthstone as an engagement ring. De Beers convinced everybody that you needed to give a diamond because a diamond is forever, just like your relationship, allegedly, right? It's interesting to me that I now have heard and read that lots of people of your generation, if they are getting married, there are lots of you that are choosing not to get married, at least not until later in life. But if you are getting married, that a lot of people are dropping from the wedding vows until death do us part, as part of a recognition that probably it's not going to be until death do you part. But so De Beers did this whole marketing campaign to convince you that you needed to have a diamond because a diamond was forever. Most of the time we sell through indirect channels. So you'll have a producer who will sell maybe to a retailer and the retailer to the consumer. More likely, it'll go through a producer and a wholesaler to a retailer and a consumer, or a producer who uses an agent who then sells to a wholesaler who sells to a retailer and ultimately to a consumer. In the business to business, you can again have direct. IBM sells directly, for example, to commercial users, but a lot of times you have indirect in that as well, where you'll have a producer who will sell to an industrial distributor and then an industrial user, or an agent. They use a lot of agents in industrial manufacturing stuff that will sell to the end user. You can have a producer, agent, industrial user, producer, agent, industrial distributor, and then ultimately an industrial user. We're now seeing a lot of multi-channel marketing being used. So, for example, lots of producers now have outlet stores that sell. My pants are Tommy Bahama today that I'm wearing. I like Tommy Bahama. Tommy Bahama sells to Dillard's, right? They also sell in their own retail stores that are branded Tommy Bahama stores. They sell online. So they use a multi-channel approach to marketing, which is reaching the consumer ultimately where they want to be reached. Lots of people who are older than me they still have this idea, and lots of people who buy Tommy Bahama have a tendency to be older than me. I'm probably one of the younger consumers of Tommy Bahama because, they tend to be traditionalists. They don't want to buy online. They don't view buying clothes as a legitimate way of doing it because it's risky, because it may not fit. So you want to try it on. So they use a multi-channel strategy. You can have a dual distribution strategy, which is again what De Beers is currently doing. So De Beers historically did not sell directly to consumers. They have their own stores now, like I said, in Houston, where I was this past weekend to watch my niece's cheernastics competition. They actually have a De Beers store in the Galleria in Houston. And they also sell to what they used to call sites. So the way De Beers worked was they would source diamonds, and then they would provide uncut stones to sites who would then cut them, who would then sell to retailers. But they're now using a dual distribution strategy. Vertical marketing, where you have a producer and it's corporate. Van Heusen, a textile producer, is one of these that does they had corporate stores. They're now selling, they've eliminated almost all of those, I think, and they're selling back through traditional retail models. You can also have contractual, which are, for example, in lots of small towns, they have smaller grocery stores. If they can't have a huge Walmart, and Walmart has tried to go into some of these small towns. So, for example, where I used to board my horses was out in Luther, and Walmart actually tried to open what was kind of like a neighborhood market in that market, and it didn't work. It wasn't profitable, and they closed it. So in those locations, a lot of times you'll find these smaller grocers that are independent, and they are through a contractual system like the International Grocers Association, where they pool their stuff together so that they can take advantage of the discounts that retailers like Walmart get from just having a huge size. So the factors that you have to think about when you decide that you're going to produce something and how are you going to get it to consumer is, what kind of coverage do you want? Do you want intensive coverage? So if you sell, if you're the manufacturer of Reese's Peanut Butter Cups, which is my favorite candy, you want to sell everywhere. You want Reese's to be widely available. And so you have an intensive, as opposed to Rolex. Rolex doesn't want to be sold everywhere. It takes a lot to become a Rolex authorized dealer. And you can lose that dealership very easily. There used to be 2 authorized Rolex dealers in the Oklahoma City area. One of them was discounting, and Rolex found out about it because they were right across the street from the other Rolex dealer. So one of the Rolex dealers was BC Clark, and they had a location in Penn Square Mall. And right across the street was Samuel Gordon Jewelers, And Samuel Gordon had a Rolex dealership. They were undercutting the prices to basically get more people to walk across or drive across the street. And BC Clark, I think, figured it out and turned them into Rolex, and they lost their dealership. Rolex doesn't discount, right? So it's an exclusive, more exclusive sort of distribution. Or is it selective, where it's not quite as narrow as an exclusive, but not as broad as an intensive coverage, which is things like consumer packaged goods? What are the buying requirements that are going to be necessary? If this is a business product or an industrial product, the buying requirements are going to have a lot more technical specifications attached to them. And so it's going to be far more important that those technical specs be met. And so the buying requirements are going to determine a lot of the channel function. And then, of course, profitability, which is ultimately what you have to have if you're going to stay in business. You have to be profitable. So looking at the channel choice that maximizes your profitability. Are there any questions about channels marketing? I finished early. If you're offended, you let me know, and we will stay late some afternoon when or some morning when I don't finish early. Any questions about channels? I know I went through this very quickly. It's because I hate channels. It's not my area of expertise. If you want to know more about channels, we do have a program in marketing. Dr. Ginchev is the one who teaches logistics and materials management. So if you're interested in that, it is one of those careers that you can make a lot of money at if you're good at logistics. So I'm going to stop the stream, and I will do your